thrilled to be able to host this conversation this evening with Sean McDowell, and so we'll introduce him in a moment's time. So great to have you here. My co-host for this evening is Ben Jack. Ben Jack is an evangelist from the UK, and he's part of our Advance movement. In fact, he was the one who wrote the first Advance manual, and he's just completing the second one and third one, which is to come. And so we're really excited about the developments of the Advance movement, which is here to serve you. So great to have Ben with me tonight. Hey, Ben, why don't you unmute yourself and just perhaps even introduce what Advance is to those who are a part of this webinar tonight.
So, hey, everybody. As Des says, I'm Ben Jack, and calling in from Manchester in the UK. Delighted to be here with you this evening. Really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to be having with Sean, which is no doubt going to get us all thinking and be super helpful tonight. Just a quick explanation for those of you that aren't familiar as of yet with Advance. The whole thing began 5 years ago when the founder of the organization that I am based at in the UK, the Message Trust, a guy called Andy Hawthorne, he really wanted to mentor some younger preaching evangelists, not necessarily younger in age, but perhaps younger in experience. And so he started to gather guys and gals in groups to mentor them and to sharpen them up, to really address a few key questions like, what is the gospel that we're actually proclaiming? What character are we going into the world in, and are we being accountable? You know, some of us as evangelists have a tendency to be a little bit maverick at times, and so we wanted to make sure that we were actually, you know, working alongside each other effectively to stir each other, to encourage each other, to equip, empower, and to hold each other to account as well for the lifestyle. Not divorced from the responsibility of the local church, of course, but I guess just like-minded evangelists getting alongside like-minded evangelists. And then fast forward 5 years, and through our partnership with Palau and NGA and the Global Network of Evangelists and various other GNE acronyms, we've seen a beautiful growth around the world of men and women wanting to sharpen up in their evangelism, whether that's your average Christian who just really wants to get effective as a witness, right through to those who sense a calling to be full-time evangelists in whatever capacity that looks like. And through the resource that we have, this advanced mentoring guide that some of you I know are already engaging with, you're able to gather in kind of peer mentoring groups once a month, use the materials and other resources and your own experience to journey together and grow in your evangelism and your commitment to the gospel. And so it's super exciting now to have groups in over 30 nations around the world, and even for some of you guys on the call tonight to have been in some of the first groups that we launched internationally, which is really cool. And also Des asked me to mention some of the things that we've got upcoming, which is cool, because as we're developing the materials for year 2 and year 3, and that's all going to be available for free from September onwards, and the year 1 is available now at advancedgroups.org. You can go there and download that immediately for free, and the rest of the materials will go up there for free from September, October at the latest time this year. But Des and I have also started a new series of books called Advanced Proclaimers series, and mine and Des's volumes of that series will be coming out in July. And they're just short thematic studies that use a moment of proclamation from the Bible to then drill into an evangelistic idea that can be applied to the life of the reader. I guess if the group material is the technical group-based stuff, this Proclaimers series is the devotional stuff that you can read individually to help you grow. I suspect for many of you on this call as evangelists, it might actually be something that's better served for you to recommend to other people to take a look at who may not yet be quite stepping into the full adventure of witness in the day-to-day. And then finally, we're also developing a podcast because, you know, since Corona kicked in, everyone's on lockdown, everyone's been developing podcasts, so we thought we might as well get involved as well. And we don't want to deny the world the dulcet tones of Des Henry either. So we are developing a little podcast that his South African tones can come through, and we'll hope to launch that in June. and I'm sure Des will connect you, but hopefully that will be of use in stirring more conversation with evangelists around the globe. We really don't want to add to the noise. There's so many great things out there already. And so we've thought very carefully about, if we were going to do something like this, what would be the point of it? And I think for us, the point is to build on the ongoing mentoring that you guys are already doing through your mentoring groups, and providing a podcast that would both help you to continue to do that, but also something that you could then use to reach out to those who are not engaging in that kind of stuff, but might actually benefit from some of the same teaching and materials. So there you go. Exciting times, Des.
That's awesome, man. It's so great to have you as part of this conversation. And this evening, or this morning, depending on which part of the globe you're on, and it's great to see participants from Africa, from the UK, from our imperial island in the UK there, to North America and all parts of the world. It's great to do that, to be a part of that. And so tonight we are going to be welcoming Sean McDowell. In fact, Dr. Sean McDowell. It's great to have Sean as part of this conversation tonight. Sean is a gifted evangelist, is a prolific writer, and serves also as an associate professor at Biola University, has written over 20 books, and is just so well respected and well known and well thought of. And so we are so looking forward to learning and engaging with you this evening, Sean. Welcome to our webinar this evening.
Oh my goodness, Des and Ben, thanks for having me on. All the evangelists just love what you're doing. I hope this in some way will encourage and equip you.
Thank you. We so appreciate that. And so this is a conversation tonight. So if you're a part of this, a live event, either on Facebook or in the webinar right now, we'll be monitoring both feeds. So if you have a question for Sean, he's going to solve all of your theological and evangelism problems tonight, right? So you could ask him the tough questions, and he is going to prove his worth in answering that today. I'm just kidding, but we'd love to interact with you. Please post your questions as we delve into some really great topics that will help us as we serve the kingdom of God and God's purposes at this crossroads that we find ourselves in. And so let's maybe start off with the topic of evangelism, right? Because we're an evangelistic association, and we're expressly serving evangelists, not only in North America, but right around the world. But in a sense, it feels like, Sean, evangelism has fallen on hard times in many ways. And looking at the recent Barna study, it shows that a fairly large percentage of millennials or Gen Zs kind of believe that it may be morally wrong to share their faith with other people, try and convert others to Christianity. And so many see evangelism in a very ugly kind of way today. And this is true not only in North America, but right around the world, where evangelism has fallen on hard times. So, I mean, looking at evangelism specifically and how we engage the next generation, I mean, how would you advise us in this way?
Well, this is a great question. And I think we need to ask, why has evangelism fallen on hard times in the mind of millennials and many Gen Zers? Because it used to be with previous generations, there was always a fear and apprehension about doing evangelism as a whole. So people would say, well, that's somebody else's job. Now they're not only saying it's somebody else's job, now they're saying somebody else shouldn't do it, that it's wrong and that it's immoral. Now, this is not all of Gen Z, of course, but an increasing number are questioning it. And of course, the question is why? And I think at its root, we have this ethic that's being pushed so hard with younger generations: diversity, 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 inclusion, inclusion, including evangelism as a whole. So people, I was hearing a little feedback here. Because they're getting diversity and inclusion pushed on them, you're supposed to accept people on their own terms and not be judgmental about how somebody else sees the world. And of course, evangelism comes along. It says, no, actually, even though you probably don't use these words, everybody else is wrong, and Jesus is the only way. This strikes this underlying ethic that this generation of millennials and Gen Zers many of them have adopted without even realizing that they've adopted it. So I think, I don't even know that many would express it very clearly, but it's just kind of like the air they breathe, so to speak. Just this sense of, you're going to tell somebody else they're wrong, that just doesn't strike me as right. Now, of course, to hold that position and say you shouldn't tell somebody else is wrong is actually telling you, if you hold that position, that you're wrong, but that subtlety is lost on this generation. So I think we just need to be very thoughtful about how we try to remove that barrier in our evangelism and address it the right way. So one way that I try to reach this generation, I will lead, for example, when I was giving evangelistic talk recently, I was talking about the movie Infinity War. And at the heart of Infinity War is this moral question, namely, for what would we sacrifice a human life? Is Iron Man going to get sacrificed? Is Scarlet Witch going to sacrifice Vision? Is Gamora going to get sacrificed? It's all about the sacrifice of human life. And of course, Captain America says, we're not in the business of exchanging lives, unless the only way to save the universe, which we see in Endgame, and by the way, if somebody hasn't seen it yet, I don't feel bad talking about this. You've got plenty of time. In Endgame, the one way to save the universe is by the hero laying down his life in sacrifice. Well, here's the most epic movie ever done, arguably, and they climax with a story that mirrors the gospel. Now, if we can start in our preaching saying, look, you know this is true, your heart wants this to be true, guess what? This is the story of Jesus. That's a way that starts with what they really believe and have common ground, and it starts removing some of the barriers, I think, that people have instantly that bumps up against evangelism. So we can walk through some of those particulars, but we just have to be aware that in the back of many minds, if we're going to tell people they should just believe in Jesus and everybody else is wrong, that's going to be a huge resistance. So how do we preach the gospel in a way that doesn't soften that truth, but also removes it in a way where they can see Jesus for who he is?
Mm. Yeah, Sean, in the UK, we've been seeing a huge amount of openness and interest in spiritual conversation and faith-based questions as people have their regular foundations shaken. And perhaps some of the idea of not imposing your views onto people that we've just been talking about there have begun to soften as people have actually taken a step towards the church of their own volition. But I think even as people have done that, what they've been getting back is perhaps a response at times from the church, which is more about making people feel better rather than actually delivering the gospel itself. So is there a challenge, even if we can get people to think correctly about the opportunity and the responsibility of proclaiming the gospel, that it's also then the gospel that we proclaim needs to be considered as well?
Ben, this is really interesting, and I will be curious to see when studies come out after this whole COVID-19 instance, how much spirituality people are open to and how long that lasts. But that's fascinating. You're seeing those trends in the UK. So let me take you back about 6 or 8 months ago. I was speaking at a conference in California where I live. And before I went to the conference, the man emailed me who's in charge of it and said, hey, there's a former youth pastor who left his faith, and he's coming to the conference to hear you and your dad. Just so you know. I said, great. You think he'd be up for having lunch? I don't want to preach at him. I just want to talk to him, see if I can answer some of his questions. Turns out in the middle of the conference, we had lunch. And this is a former youth pastor, articulate, the kind of person you put in front of teenagers because he's funny, good looking, fun, articulate, just can lead a bunch of teenagers, including junior hires. Well, he asked me questions for probably 45 minutes. I did my best to answer, and I just felt like it was not connecting with him. And then at the very end, he says this to me. He goes, so do you have any final advice for me on my journey? And I said, well, here's what my experience is. Whenever I see somebody who's in the church and leaves, I find some bad theology, something they just didn't understand about God. I said, did you ever have an experience where you are down on your knees, aware of your sin, and pleading with God for forgiveness. And it was like a deer in the headlights. He said, no, I came to faith because I was hurting and told that Jesus would make me feel better and heal me. I sat there and thought, oh my goodness, he doesn't even understand and has never believed the gospel. So I think studies have shown with Gen Z that depression and loneliness, sometimes this generation has described themselves as the most lonely generation. So coming out of this COVID, there will be a big temptation for people to preach, come to Jesus, he'll heal your loneliness. Come to Jesus, he'll heal your depression. And although we know Jesus is a part of the answer to becoming a whole human being, that's not the gospel at its core. So we have to be sure as evangelists that we don't soften the message, we don't adapt it in a way that makes it more appealing, but undermines that the heart is we are sinners in need of forgiveness. And then when we experience that forgiveness, we have the body of Christ, we have the Holy Spirit, we have the scriptures in a transformed worldview that can start to heal us and make us better. So I'm with you 100%. We've just got to be sure we're actually preaching the gospel, not conforming so much as I would argue the seeker-sensitive movement has at times to try to reach where people are at and compromise the nature of the message itself.
That's good. That's so helpful. And I think that's a challenge we face right around the world. I mean, in the African context, again, the gospel has become the propagation of the American dream mentality, and the prosperity gospel has replaced what the gospel is in essence in our context in Africa. And so there is always that tendency to preach to what people really kind of want to hear, or I guess as a preacher, we feel their need is to kind of hear that rather than the real gospel or what the gospel really is. I'd be keen, Sean, just to hear a brief definition from you as to what do you think the gospel is?
Oh, I think essentially the gospel is that God has designed us to be in a relationship with him, and sin has separated us in our relationship from the Creator, and the wages of sin is death. And the gospel is believing in the grace that Jesus has given to us by free through faith. And then we are saved and restored because of what Jesus has done for us. So at the heart of the gospel is God forgiving sinners through the death and resurrection of Jesus that we accept by grace through faith.
Good. I like that. That's well thought out. Ben, do you have a question there?
Yeah, just to carry on in this conversation, because I think it's so interesting that, again, we're looking at these statistics of people, Gen Zers in particular, saying that they struggle with the ethical implications, imposing their own views on and religious stance on other people. And then we're talking about when even we can get people to do it, they're perhaps struggling to successfully and accurately articulate the gospel. And I guess I'm just interested to see what you think, Sean, in terms of that. Actually, one hand washes the other there, in that it is part of the problem of people struggling to supposedly impose their views on others, the fact that they haven't actually understood the gospel in the first place.
Oh, that definitely could be the case. I think there's probably two things going on. I think there's some people who don't understand the gospel and are reticent to really preach it to others because they haven't experienced the forgiveness of Jesus and transformation in their lives. So if you're a believer because the community, if you're a believer because your family, if you're a believer because it makes you feel good or some secondary reason, then you're going to feel bad forcing that on somebody else, because this is just something that works in your life and another religion could work for somebody else. And this is what our increasingly global secular culture, I would argue, not so much that people are becoming atheists. That's actually not the case. But the secular way of thinking is deeply influencing the West and the East, says that religion should be privatized in your life. It's not something that's public. It's not something that constitutes knowledge in the way math and, say, history and science do. So if religion is just something personalized to me, then I'm not going to force it on anybody else any more than I'm going to force to you, like, hey, my favorite ice cream is chocolate peanut butter ice cream. You should like vanilla. Well, that just sounds dumb. Or here's my favorite sport. You should like that favorite sport. Or I like the beach. You like the mountains. Like, if religion is just a preference thing, which our secular culture says, then of course we're going to feel bad forcing it on somebody else. But if you flip that and realize somebody is dying of cancer and you actually have the cure to it, objectively speaking, then it's actually loving. It's not loving if you don't speak the truth. Well, the gospel says there is a sickness, and it's called sin, and the cure is only found in the person of Jesus. So I do think you're right. At the heart of it is, I wonder how many people really, number one, have experienced the transforming power of the gospel and forgiveness, and second, realize that we're talking about truth. We're talking about knowledge. You know, the word knowledge shows up in the Bible actually more than faith. Like 1 John 5:13, we know that we have eternal life. I know that 2 + 2 = 4. I know George Washington was the first president of the United States. And I know that Jesus rose from the dead. I actually know this. So part of the heart of this is for people to realize, number one, have I experienced this myself? And second, we can know this with confidence. That's what gives people a boldness to speak out and talk about this, even though our culture resists these ideas.
Yeah, I've often wondered if the lack of people sharing their faith wasn't their own lack of, believing it themselves. Is this really true? Because if we don't really believe the truth of the gospel, we're not really going to share it with others. And so that's a hugely important point you're bringing across there for us to be mindful of. This is good news to be shared ultimately. And so, if we believe it's truth has to be communicated in a way that is compelling for all that are listening in. But what for you would be some of the questions that both millennials and Gen Z are asking, and perhaps even in general, people are asking during this like really challenging time of COVID-19? What are some of the questions that people are asking, and how can we really speak to the questions of our day as those seeking to evangelize?
Well, I would say the biggest questions that are coming up, and some of the studies like Barna's study on Gen Z would say, some of the top questions are problem of evil and suffering. It always has, and it always will be. One of the oldest books in the Bible, if not the oldest, Job, is about pain and suffering. This is a human question. And I think COVID-19 has only just exacerbated this and made it that much more pressing for people. I'm seeing it on social media all the time where people are going, yeah, you think God is good? Why would he create COVID? As if that like ends the conversation. So that's always been a question people have asked, and it's been heightened today. Some of the other questions, at least in a North American context, I know are coming up, are questions like the seeming bad things that Christians have done and religion has caused. This is a big barrier for people. And sometimes they'll point to the Crusades. Sometimes they'll point to abuse in the Catholic Church. They'll point to racism in the past. But this idea that religion has caused harm is in the back of the minds of many of this generation, which is why I actually think a lot of the questions this generation are primarily asking is not, is Christianity true, but is Christianity good? And this is a big shift from 70s, 80s, and even 90s when my father would speak on college campuses on the resurrection, reliability of Scripture, deity of Christ, make the argument that it's true. Now many people won't even consider whether it's true or not if they don't think it's good. And that's because some of the other questions that people are asking are specifically tied to this LGBTQ conversation. And this is worldwide. Almost everywhere I go, people are asking about same-sex marriage. They're asking about transgender. And in the back of their minds, a lot of people are thinking, Christians are asking, Guy, I want to follow what Scripture says, but does this mean I have to hate my gay friends? Outsiders are thinking, many of them, I'm not even sure I'll consider this Christian faith if it means that you're hateful towards gay people, because the narrative has been so shaped by the wider culture rather than a biblical position. So I would say those are the big questions, and including questions of science and faith continue to be huge questions. whether it's historical Adam or whether it's the age of the earth, whether it's evolution. These science and faith questions are really big and pressing today as well. And I guess I would also argue questions of justice come up, especially in our context. People are talking about social justice a lot. And what does the Bible teach about justice? What does justice mean? Has the church contributed to injustice in the world? Those are big pressing questions today.
Absolutely
So,
right.
what might be the first steps for us to begin to bridge build from the challenges and the realities of the questions that people are asking in the world, whether it's empirical or moral or otherwise, to the reality of what we believe to be true from the Word of God and our experience of then applying that to our lives?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things is to just help people see that Christianity is good. I have no interest in defending religion as a whole. I'm not going to defend Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam. I want to defend Christianity while acknowledging the sins and failures of the church, historically speaking. We don't have to pretend those things don't exist, because the reality is there's never been a force in the history of the world for greater good than the Christian faith and the church. There hasn't been, although our legacy is undoubtedly flawed. So there's a lot of people who are embarrassed of this Christian faith, and I want to say, no, it's actually Christianity in the UK and the States that fought against and ended slavery. It's actually at the heart of Christianity in the book of Acts that you find this message of diversity. It's actually looking at the life of Jesus and how good and beautifully he treated women. I wrote a post on Jesus and the Me Too movement, and I said, look at all these religious figures. None of them would pass the Me Too movement except Jesus, long before. So when I teach on sexuality with students, I say, let's imagine, what if everybody lived the sexual ethic of Jesus? I mean, just think about that. We'd have no prostitution. We'd have no pornography. We'd have no abortion. We'd have no sexually transmitted diseases. We'd have no deadbeat dads. We'd have no unwanted pregnancies. Even if a pregnancy was a surprise, kid would be raised with a mom and be raised with a dad. Well, that's starting to say, not only is Christianity true, but do you see how good this person of Jesus is? That's one way that I try to weave in my communication with this generation. The second thing is almost what I call a kind of pre-evangelism, is I want to point to certain things that people deeply believe and show them that these desires are actually fulfilled in the Christian faith. So, for example, one of the things that we learn about tragedy is that it brings to the surface what matters most. I mean, I'll give you one example. 9/11 in our country, when one of the planes was going down, there was people that realized this plane was headed, I think, to the White House. And some of the people started picking up their phones, realizing this terrorist attack that was happening. They didn't call and say, hey, give me a sports update before I go. Hey, remember this about my favorite pizza. I know that sounds silly. Todd called his family and said, hey, I'm about to try to take down this terrorist. I just want you to know I love you, to his family. When tragedy hits, we all realize that people matter most. We've seen this with COVID. We've seen this generation who's been raised on smartphones realize, you know what? I want to connect this way, but I want to see people in person. I need relationships. Well, what worldview most values relationships and people? It's not atheism. Persons bubbled up through this accidental, purposeless process 13 billion years into the universe. Persons are accidental. They weren't designed. Well, not pantheism. All is one on pantheism. There's no difference between right and wrong, you and me, persons, non-persons, spirit, matter. All is one. It's actually in the Christian worldview that God is tripersonal, and love is in God's very character. So the very thing your heart yearns for, interestingly enough, is uniquely found to be true in the Christian faith. So to me, what I'm trying to, I think of like a beach ball. You take a beach ball and you push it under the water. it's going to bounce back up because of the nature of gravity and water and the beach ball. Well, I know that people who don't even believe in God live in God's world and they're still made in his image. I want to bring to the surface deep yearnings and heart desires that they have and help reflect it back to them and show them and say, you know what? You do believe this and you yearn for this. This is uniquely found true in Christianity. And so my goal is to say, actually, before I want to convince them Christianity is true, I actually want to convince them you actually wish Christianity were true if you really understood what this message and this God and this gospel is about. That's one unique way of pulling out of them. And then they often will go, oh, I get it. I see it. So because there's so much resistance to the gospel, that's a way of just coming through the back door, so to speak, and helping them realize there's something about Christianity that actually, if you really understand it and remove some of these objections, I think you'd look at it very differently and almost want Jesus to be the person that he claimed to be.
That's good.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I was thinking as well about the power. Sorry, Des. Just wanted to throw one thing in, which was that there's the power of wonder. I've just been reading Becky Pippett's new book, and she talks in that about how she's harnessed over the years, seizing upon the power of people's wonder, and that people are a little bit skeptical these days that wonder can be more than just what it is, just a reaction to something, but investigated a little bit more, close attention to detail, and people actually start having these questions, just like you're saying, that things rise to the surface, whether it's the wonder of becoming a parent or the wonder of playing a piece of music that moves you in some way. I guess alongside answering people's objections, the inverse, but on the same scale, would be to help people think through not necessarily their objections, but the great experiences that they have, and how that might point to something beyond.
I think that's exactly right. If I could jump in here, Alistair McGrath, who teaches at Oxford, has a book coming out in August on wonder. And this is the entire premise of it. He's arguing that there's something about us that realizes the laws of physics and matter and chemistry can't capture this wonder we have as human beings to experience love, to experience beauty, to understand the world and its depths in which we live. What does that tell us about what it means to be human? Because we don't need this sense of wonder if we evolved through this purposeless, naturalistic process. We can survive without it. Mm-hmm. Maybe we've been designed to understand the world and to wonder about it because this Christian story is true and we've been made in the image of God who's a person. So I think you're on the right track. And sometimes that's not going from A to Z sharing the gospel, depending upon the setting, but it's kind of putting a stone in somebody's shoe to move them along to just ask questions that ultimately only make sense in the Christian worldview.
Good. That's great. Ultimately, I believe that Christianity is good for the world. We've seen that with the modern Christian movement, missionary movement, a sense of redemption and lift that has happened right around the world. Wherever the Christian faith has been planted, we've seen that society has changed for the good. So, I mean, notwithstanding, for instance, in Africa, where we have the colonial sort of mandate that came along with the missionary view, we saw, great things happening in education, in medicine, in so many different social atmospheres surrounding how the gospel has changed people's lives. But I just often wonder, the ordinary person, evangelist, Christian, who's interested in sharing their faith, often feels very paralyzed by some of the questions that people answer. On a very practical level, I mean, how would you advise people to respond to the questions, which are good questions that people are asking today? You don't have to be a PhD graduate. You don't have to be a great apologist to, as you say, kind of put the stone in people's shoe and just make them really think and wonder about all of these great truths of the Christian faith.
So I would say a couple things. If I'm sharing the gospel with somebody and a tough question comes up, sometimes I'll ask them this question. I'll say, you know what, that's a really thoughtful question. If I could answer that question, would that help you be closer to believing God and becoming a Christian? Now that kind of brings to the surface, how sincere of a question is this? Or is it just something that I'm pushing to distract the issue? And I've had people say, you know what, honestly, it wouldn't make a difference. I say, okay, good. Fair enough. I could address it, but what would make a difference? What really is the issue? Because that's what I want to talk about.
Right.
So it's a fair way of just saying, okay, great question. And sometimes people say, yeah, it actually would. Great. Then I know there's a sincerity that's here. So again, the question is just simply, if I could give you some thoughtful ways to answer this, would that help you be one step closer to becoming a believer or not? Second, when you look at how Jesus communicated, it worked then and it works now. He told stories. So as evangelists, we got to tell good, truthful stories because people can check the facts. And if we exaggerate and mess things up, we lose all credibility. And so does the gospel along with it. So we have to tell stories. But second, Jesus just asked questions. He asked questions. So oftentimes when people challenge me, I just ask questions back. I try to do this on social media when I can. And, you know, sometimes my frustration gets the best of me, but I think if I could just ask questions to people, get them to think, that's so much more valuable. So, you know, whatever this question is, I got to think of a question somebody asked me recently. I'll just simply ask a question back. How do you know that? How'd you come to that conclusion? And put the burden of proof upon them, because anybody, even if you don't know the answer, you can ask questions. The other thing is, I also don't be afraid to say, you know what? That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. I say that, and I have a PhD in apologetics and write books and speak and debate on this stuff. People look at me, they're like, well, Sean must have the answer. Sometimes I'm like, actually, I don't. I got to ask somebody else. That is fine. That's great. In fact, I actually think people respect that today. So I try when somebody asks me a question and I don't really know the answer, rather than making up something that's second rate, if I do that, I'll say, you know what, I haven't studied this as much as I'd like, but if I had to guess, here's what I would say, but I feel like I need to give this a little bit more thought. Or I'll just simply say, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to find it and I'm going to get back to you. And my dad told me, he said, it's okay to be stumped once, but don't be stumped twice of the same question. This is how you learn and how you grow. So I think a lot of people are afraid to share their faith because someone's going to ask a question they don't have an answer to. Well, you don't have to have all the answers. If somebody asks you, just say, I don't know, and look it up. Email me through my site. I actually have an assistant who will look up and find answers and help you out. So bottom line, everybody can ask questions and everybody can say, you know what, I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to find an answer and get back to you. And you get credibility in the eyes of the person for being honest. You keep the conversation going and you will learn something during the process as well.
That's great. Sean, you just mentioned something now that I think is so pivotal. I mean, we live in this digital age, and I mean, there's information out there. Some of it is great and legit, and others is just crazy. So, I mean, how do people get in touch with you? You mentioned you have an assistant that can help with getting answers. What would you recommend as great resources for people who are thinking through some of these questions?
Well, that's a great question, and it would probably depend upon the kind of question that they're wrestling with. My website is seanmcdowell.org, and I get questions all the time, and I have an assistant who really knows his stuff. We'll send books. Sometimes he answers the question himself, send videos, try to direct you to a good, trustworthy source, because today everybody has a microphone, and some people really haven't done their work and don't know what they're talking about. So I would, anybody there, if you email in, we'll do my best to help you find the right resource and answer. I guess in some books, if it comes to the questions of the historical Jesus, I mean, almost 45 years ago, my father wrote the book Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And I just worked with 12 leading scholars in the world and 36 grad students to update that book. And it deals with the deity of Christ, the reliability of scriptures, and the resurrection of Jesus. And so that book, it actually won an award for the year. And what got me so excited is that was a way of just honoring my father and his legacy. Well, we have been very, very careful in that book. So that's one to have on your shelf. When those three kinds of questions come up, you can pull it off and know that we have done our homework. And also in that book, what we do is we cite some of the other leading scholars and resources in the world. So you read something, go, ooh, I want to go further on the resurrection. William Lane Craig, N.T. Wright, Michael Licona, Gary Habermas. You know who the key people are to track down. Even if you don't get their books, you know who they are to go to YouTube, to go to social media, and to trust that kind of material. So on the historical Jesus, I think that would be one good place to start specifically.
That's helpful. We've been doing all the talking, and I'm sure there must be some questions that you have. And so if you wouldn't mind posting those questions in the chat line right now, and we'll seek to answer them. This has been great content that will be, again, available on our website to you. And so you can go through this again and maybe even get some friends over and have it around, have them around and discuss some of these things with them too. So if you have your questions, post them in the chat line now. Ben's going to jump to the topic of leadership and how do we develop emerging evangelists? So looking at the specific idiosyncrasies of Gen Z and millennials, how do we develop evangelists from them? So, hey, Ben, why don't you lead in that conversation and I'll monitor the Q&A line.
Great. Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things that we're constantly trying to do in Advance is both equip the average Christian to be a faithful witness by doing some of the things we've already talked about, making sure they have a really good understanding of the gospel first and foremost, and then everything that flows from that. But the other thing that we're really excited about, and of course is the whole point of Next Generation Alliance, is to equip evangelists specifically. But before you can equip evangelists, they need to be evangelists. And I think increasingly one of the things that people are confused by is, what does that actually mean to be an evangelist? How do I know that I'm called to be an evangelist? And that could become even the vocation of my entire life at the cost of any other pursuit. How would you go about helping particularly young people to figure that out?
That's a great question. I am not a full-time evangelist. I'm a full-time professor and apologist. So you honestly probably have some better connections than I do in this regard. But I think here's just my general big advice. One of the mistakes I made when I first became a teacher is I thought, you know what? I'm going to reinvent this whole thing myself. I'm not following any curriculum. I'm going to do this myself because I got this. Halfway through the year, I was like, dear Lord, what am I doing? I'm getting no sleep. I'm making so many mistakes. Why didn't I just start following those who've gone before me and then figure it out as I go? And I think the same thing is true for evangelism, is if I was starting now and I wanted to distinctly be an evangelist, I would just find the people that I think do it well and also that resonate with my own approach. So for me, if I was going to join an evangelistic organization, it probably would be Ravi Zacharias Ministries. And that's because they bring a little bit more of kind of an intellectual, thoughtful approach, which just is the way I'm wired, and I resonate with that. And they try to go on university campuses. That's where I would go, and I would partner with them, I would watch them, I would learn from them, and have people mentor me through the process. So I would invite a young person to say, like, my parents are on Campus Crusade for Christ. If you resonate with the mission and approach of Cru, start contacting people at Cru and say, what does it take to get in the ministry? How do I raise support? What would this look like for me? And you just find those who do it well, and you go work with them. Now, in the future, if you want to step out and start your own organization, do that in the future. But for now, find the organization that does it well, because there's so many areas of support that if you're trying to do this yourself, you will run up and bump up against and just in many ways probably burn out. And there's organizations that have thought this through. So obviously, Luis Palau organization, find out, hey, what does it take to work with you? How would you equip me? And find those organizations and have them mentor you. The other way is to say it's getting harder and harder today for a lot of people to just do this full time because you maybe have to raise support. And especially with this COVID outbreak, it could be harder, not impossible. I'm not trying to discourage what God can do, but I encourage to a lot of apologists, I say, look, if you have a job, what time do you have each week? Do you have 2 hours? Do you have 10 hours? What time do you have? And how can you just get in the game and make a difference right now? Maybe that's writing one blog a week. Maybe that's doing a YouTube video. Maybe that's starting a Twitter feed, maybe a Facebook group. Maybe you go meet with people in person and start mentoring them. Sometimes we look at people like Ravi and say, I want to be the next Ravi or whoever it is. I want to be the next Luis Palau. Instead of just saying, you know what? Can I be faithful with the time and resources that God has given me now? Because scripture does say, if you're faithful in little, you'll be faithful in a lot. So in sum, look to the organizations that do it well, get their support, get their advice, lean on them. And second, just start doing it right now. Get your foot in the door, so to speak, and begin to make a difference. And if we had more people thinking that way, man, we could make a huge difference. Like for me, I know it sounds funny, but my son said to me a while ago, he's like, Dad, you need to get on TikTok. I was like, there's issues with China owning TikTok. I don't know about that. I'm 40 years old. There's like 12-year-old teen girls on this. What are you talking about? Well, I started a TikTok, and probably 10 or 15 minutes a day, I just answer one question. And I'm not changing the world through TikTok, but I've had some non-believers actually say to me, they go, hey, this is interesting in the resurrection. How can I watch more? So I sent them an interview I did with Lee Strobel. I had somebody say, ooh, that's interesting. Send them a book. Now, there's a lot of haters on there. Fine. But there's Christians who've been encouraged, and there's non-Christians, a few that are open-minded who have said, you know what? Tell me more, which is kind of what happens with Paul in Acts 17. Most people dismiss him, but a handful of people say, you know what? Tell me more. So that's a medium that I jumped into to try to use for apologetics and evangelism. So what opportunities are out there for you? Just start where you're at, learn from those, get your foot in the door, and then, get to the stage where you could maybe do this full time if that's your heart and desire, and God opens up those doors.
Yeah, that's super helpful, and it actually matches up perfectly with my own journey. I started out as a DJ, and then I saw that the Youth for Christ, I stumbled across them doing some stuff that was very creative, and I thought, wow, I could use my DJ stuff as part of the Christian outreach, and so go. 2 and 2 suddenly were able to go together, and that changed everything for me. Interestingly, though, as well, going into the kind of realm of at some point you might go full time. What was interesting for me was that when I joined Youth for Christ, I was able to do that full time, and it was great. But then the Lord called me back the other way, and I ended up then going and working in the nightclub scene for a long time as a DJ to be a witness, not under the guise of an organization, not as a full-time evangelist, but wow, as a DJ who wanted to live out a full-time evangelism. And so again, I think sometimes we have to be a little bit careful with the whole idea of what it even means for your evangelism to be your vocation, whether you're being paid by an organization to do it or not. I think if you have the call on your life, it's going to take over your life, whether you're with an organization or whether you're a teacher or an entrepreneur or a stay-at-home parent or whatever it might be. And how can we make sure that this younger generation kind of get this concept of actually the gold standard isn't even to go and be a full-time organizational based evangelist?
That's a great question. I love hearing this. To be honest with you, I have a friend who works in Hollywood, and he does apologetics on the side, evangelism. And sometimes I listen to him, I'm like, man, I am envious of the open doors that you have in this world of people that are not really listening to me. And I affirmed him. I was like, man, we are working together. Don't think my call is any more important or your call is. God gives us open doors. We are all called to do evangelism. We're all called to be apologists. So some of this is the language that we use. And even in the church, I might say I'm in a full-time professional ministry. I just qualify it that way because I don't want people to think there's full-time ministry and there's not full-time ministry. That's just a jargon we use in the church that's not helpful, that makes it feel like, oh, Josh McDowell ministry, Luis Palau ministry, RZIM, those are the ones that'll do evangelism. Well, that's just not helpful. And I don't think it's biblical. So that starts with our language, the way we describe things. But I think it also is we can do a better job in the church of highlighting people who aren't in full-time professional ministry, who are making a difference through their businesses, through their lives, through some other fashion that's not tied to the church or a nonprofit organization. In some ways, those are the real heroes of people because they get the gospel and they're living it out. So every chance I get to find somebody like that, I will interview them, I will highlight them, I will try to talk about them as a model so people realize, like, oh, I can actually do this where I'm at.
This has been so helpful, Sean. Thank you so much. A couple of questions that have come in. One is, in your own evangelistic speaking, how have you grown and changed, especially in recent years with millennials and Gen Z?
Wow, that's a great question. That's a really good question. I would have to say, gosh, honestly, I've got to think about this some. I feel like that answer deserves more thoughtfulness than I could give off the top of my head. But I think I guess one thing I would say, here's how I approach things. I try to be more, kind of as I described before, I try to use stories and then draw the point out of the story rather than just make a point and defend it. So oftentimes, like if I'm speaking on even pro-life, I will work very hard to find common ground with somebody to tell a story that removes an objection that they have with them not even realizing that I'm doing that. So in the past, I'd say, hey, here's my argument. Here's an objection you might have. And I still do that sometimes depending upon the audience. But now I try to think through even more systematically. What are the objections and assumptions and thought in the audience's mind? And how do I remove those where they don't really realize that I'm removing them through telling stories, finding common ground, so at the end, the gospel just makes sense to them. I think I've gotten more strategic and thoughtful of doing that by watching people who do it well. So I'll tell you somebody who did this. It's not a direct evangelistic message, but there's a pro-lifer by the name of Stephanie Gray, and she was invited to give a speech on pro-life to Google. And she's a pro-lifer. Now, she never mentions Jesus, which I actually think was smart in that setting. But I'd invite your listeners to go watch this because she tells stories. She uses humor. So at the end of this speech, she has them in the palm of her hands. And even at Google, these brilliant people have like no objections to her pro-life message. Because what she does is she realizes you want a hero in your life. You want to look up to people. You want to be good. You want to sacrifice. And then just shows them that when it's all said and done, really you want to be pro-life. And I watched it, I thought, this is brilliant. So I have in my speaking tried to tell, how do I tell better stories? How do I remove objections that people have? How do I find common ground with them so it naturally leads to the gospel and people are wanting it, even if they don't realize that they're wanting it? Somewhat of a vague answer, but that's how I've tried to respond more strategically and effectively in my speaking and in my writing.
That's great. I love that answer. I think it's very, very helpful, and it's given me some food for thought as well. Just two more questions that we've got. This is from Facebook. Can we regard Gen Z as a unique 21st century unreached people group? Interesting question.
I would say a couple things about this. I've written a book where we have a chapter on Gen Z, and it's about mentoring and reaching and discipling this generation. One of the big points we make in the book is there's a lot of data about this generation. But when we use terms like Gen Z, Gen X, millennials, there's a temptation to make them so much the other that we focus on our differences and not what we have in common. So there is data on this generation about, say, they're digitally natives and how it affects the way they see the world and build relationships that are important. But all of us who are evangelists need to keep in mind, we have much more in common with this generation than we do differences. We have much more in common with this generation than we do differences. And one of the things that we're seeing in Gen Z is the changes in this generation are not just within this generation, it's actually in all generations.
Yeah.
And that's because the way technology affects us. Now, the difference is Gen Z, they are younger and being more formed than older generations. So it affects them differently. All that is to say, I guess in some sense you could say they're an unreached people group. I don't mind that language, but I'm just somewhat reluctant to say, here's this completely different foreign group. Like we think of some other country that's totally out there. We don't know their language. We don't know how they think. They're so different. We have to utterly change everything. And I want to say, well, yes, this generation is more secular in terms of how they think than previous generations, but we also have to focus on what we have in common with them and what they want and desire and need from us as older generations in ways that unreached people groups don't have that same dynamic with us or that same perspective. So sure, you can use that term because there's a lot of Gen Zers now. What you're finding is previous generations like Xers and millennials were sometimes first generation who were secular. Now some Gen Zers are raised by secular families and have less biblical knowledge, at least in North America. I can't speak beyond that. So we can't assume certain biblical knowledge and literacy with them that we have previous generations. So in that sense, you could argue that they're kind of an unreached people group, but we also have so much more in common with them than difference. Let's focus on that, and I think that'll shape how we do reach them.
That's great. And then last question here from a local church pastor and his perspective. As a pastor / evangelist, how do I make my preaching more apologetically inclined?
First off, I absolutely love that question. And I wish more pastors were asking that question. And I'll tell you why. Just this week, there was another rock star, John Steingard from the band Hawk Nelson, who just came out this week. CNN covered it, USA Today covered it, other news stories covered it, about how he had left his faith. And there's a lot of components there, but one of them is he was socialized into the faith, never taught, why is this actually true? So he experienced some weird things in the church. It made him kind of question his faith. I experienced weird things in the church, but it didn't make me question my faith because my parents were always like, be a Christian if it's true. If it's not, don't believe it. So any pastor, you've got to weave in as you can. How do we know this is actually true? So two basic things you can do. One is you can do series specifically on apologetic topics. Some pastors do this. They'll say, hey, 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks or a summer, whatever it is. How we know the Bible is true, problem with evil, LGBTQ conversation, science and faith, whatever. You could actually pull your church and say, send me your toughest questions. And we're going to do 5 weeks addressing some of those common tough questions you have so the church really feels like they have a say in this. And then you do your homework and you address them. That's one way. The other way is to just weave into your normal preaching apologetic issues as they arrive. And I wish every pastor would do this. So if you're preaching, look, I just did an interview yesterday with Craig Keener because he has a new commentary coming out on Acts. And I asked him all these apologetic questions in Acts. The book is filled with questions about miracles, questions about diversity, questions about history. Every single chapter in that book, some apologetic question comes up. So if you get a good commentary, like Keener's 1-volume commentary is very good, and you're preaching through Acts 1, find an apologetic question or two, weave it in, and just say, hey, you might be wondering this about the Holy Spirit. We see signs and wonders. Do miracles happen today? Here's one example. So amidst your preaching, keep preaching as you are, but do your homework and weave in thoughtfully an apologetic point or two, telling your congregation, hey, there's actually really good reason that this is not only in scripture, which we trust, but it's also true historically, it's true scientifically, it's true philosophically. So you are building up people that don't just believe it because the pastor said it, that settles it, it's done, or because they're a part of a group, but they believe it and have confidence that it's true. If I were preaching, that's what I would regularly do. And by the way, this is going to take a little bit more work because you have to get it right. If you miss stuff, people are going to Google it and you will lose authority in their eyes. That's just what happens. But I want to encourage you to take that risk and weave in apologetic themes as you preach. And I actually think your congregation will enjoy it and appreciate it. And I've seen when it's done well, people really respond positively to that because they want to know if it's true.
That's great. Thank you for answering those questions. And we've come to the top of the hour already. Man, it's gone so fast. It's been great to interact with you on these questions and on these various topics. And I've learned so much and just appreciate your experience and what you bring to the table. Thank you so much, Sean.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. That was a lot of fun. Great questions from you guys and from those who are watching. Very thoughtful.
Ben, just in terms of advance, if you are interested in joining or starting an advanced group, Ben, why don't you just tell us how to do that?
It's very straightforward. Head over to www.advancedgroups.org and you can find out all the information about how to start a group or potentially join one if there's already one running in your region, although we are really looking for evangelists to take the initiative to actually get new groups started and bring others along with them. I'm sure that's relevant for many on this call. And the leader's guide that explains how everything works and goes through the sessions, it'll tell you everything you need to know and give you all the material. You can download that. It's not like you need to subscribe before you download it or give us your information. You can go and download that first, give it a read. If you think, yeah, this is something that I want to get involved with, then sign up on the relevant pages. If you're US based, you'll see that link will ultimately redirect you back to the Next Generation Alliance page, and it will all be handled through NGA. If you're anywhere else in the world, it will direct you through to various localized sites around the world we're already operating in. And if you're in a country that we don't currently have something happening, then we'd love to talk to you and see if we can get something going. And the materials are available in various different languages. If it's not currently available in your language, I don't know how you're listening to this talk right now, but maybe you can speak English as well. But if you need it in another language that doesn't currently exist, then let us know and we'll try to get that sorted for you as well.
Join the movement, man. It's great to be part of Advance and great to have some of my Advance group guys on board today's chat. So thank you so much. Thank you for joining us this day, and I pray this has been as helpful to you as it has been to me. And please, again, like and share this with as many friends as you're able to do so, because I think this is something we all need to be mindful of as those who want to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. God bless you. Have a wonderful day. Bye.